When my brother and I walked away from the foster care system, we never imagined we'd inherit a lakeside cabin, or that we'd find an elderly woman living there who'd change everything. My name is Elena. I'm 25 years old, and my brother Marcus is 21. We grew up bouncing between foster homes in Seattle, Washington, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home, never really believing that concept even existed for kids like us. The system was all we knew, a rotating door of temporary bedrooms, temporary families, and the constant reminder that we were just passing through other people's lives. Marcus and I clung to each other through every placement, every disappointed foster parent who realized we came as a package deal and decided we were too much trouble. We made a promise to each other when I was 16 and he was 12. The moment I aged out, I'd find a way to keep us together, no matter what it took. I kept that promise. The day I turned 18, I got a tiny studio apartment in a rough neighborhood, worked 3 jobs: waitressing, retail, overnight stocking at a grocery store. Whatever it took to make rent and save enough for Marcus to visit on weekends. Those visits were everything. Watching him walk through that door, seeing his face light up because he had somewhere to go that wasn't another foster placement, made every exhausting shift worth it. We dreamed constantly about the day he'd turn 18, when we could finally start our real lives together, away from caseworkers and court dates and the endless feeling of being unwanted. That day came on a rainy Thursday in October, gray and cold in the way Seattle specializes in, the kind of weather that seeps into your bones and makes you wonder if you'll ever feel warm again. Marcus showed up at my apartment with everything he owned in a duffel bag, and we just sat on my lumpy couch, staring at each other, hardly believing this moment had finally arrived. No more asking permission. No more surprise visits from social workers. Just us, finally free to figure out who we were without the system defining it for us. 3 days later, everything changed again. I got a call from a lawyer's office, Reynolds and Associates, asking if I was Elena Martinez, formerly Elena Rodriguez, before I'd taken my foster family's name and then changed it back. My heart started racing because calls from lawyers never meant anything good in my experience. I told them yes, I was Elena, and the woman on the phone, professional but oddly gentle, said they needed to meet with me, Marcus, and regarding an inheritance. She wouldn't say more over the phone, just gave me an address and a time for the next day. Marcus and I spent that entire night trying to figure out what this could mean. Inheritance? We had no family. That was the fundamental truth of our entire existence. Our mother had died when Marcus was a baby, and I was 4, an overdose, according to our file, and our father was listed as unknown. No grandparents, no aunts or uncles, no one who'd ever stepped forward to claim us. We'd stopped imagining we had family out there somewhere, because that kind of hope hurt too much when it went nowhere. So who could have left us anything? And why now? The law office was in downtown Seattle, the kind of building with marble floors and expensive art on the walls that made me hyper-aware of my worn-out jacket and Marcus's scuffed sneakers. The receptionist smiled warmly, though, like she didn't notice or didn't care, and showed us to a conference room where a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and perfectly styled silver hair was waiting. She introduced herself as Patricia Reynolds, and before she said anything else, she asked if we wanted coffee or water, a small gesture that somehow steadied my nerves. We both said yes to water, and once we were settled, Patricia opened a file folder and looked at us with an expression I couldn't quite read. Sympathy mixed with something else, maybe curiosity about how we'd react to what she was about to tell us. She said she'd been trying to locate us for 8 months, that it had taken significant effort because we'd moved through so many placements and name changes, but that she'd finally found us. And then she told us about someone named Catherine Flores, a woman who'd passed away almost a year ago at the age of 73, who'd left explicit instructions in her will that we were to inherit everything she had. I exchanged glances with Marcus, seeing my own confusion reflected at me. Neither of us had ever heard that name. Patricia seemed to expect this reaction because she pulled out a photograph, old and slightly faded, and slid it across the table toward us. The woman in the photo was young, maybe in her 30s, with dark hair and eyes that looked startlingly familiar, though I couldn't place why. She was standing in front of a small cabin with trees all around, holding a baby and smiling at whoever was taking the picture. Patricia's voice softened as she explained that Catherine Flores had been our maternal grandmother, our mother's mother, and the baby in the photograph was our mother, Isabel. My hands started shaking as I held that picture, staring at the face of a woman I'd never known existed, holding a baby who would grow up to have 2 children she couldn't take care of, who would die and leave those children alone. Hey, if you're finding this story compelling and want to hear more real-life tales of unexpected inheritance, hidden family secrets, and the complicated relationships we never see coming, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. We share authentic stories that will make you think deeply about family, forgiveness, and what home really means. And I'm genuinely curious. If you suddenly discovered you had family you never knew about, family who'd watched you struggle from a distance, how would you react? Would you feel angry, grateful, confused, or something else entirely? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I absolutely love reading your perspectives, and honestly, your engagement helps these stories reach people who really need to hear them. Now let's get back to what Elena and Marcus discovered next, because trust me, this inheritance came with secrets that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their family. Patricia continued with the story we'd never been told. Catherine had been 19 when she had our mother, Isabel, a single mother in the 1970s, when that carried a serious stigma, especially in small conservative communities. She'd struggled financially, working multiple jobs while trying to raise a baby on her own, and when Isabel was 3, Catherine had made what Patricia described as an impossible choice. Catherine's sister, who was married and financially stable but unable to have children, had offered to adopt Isabel, to give her the kind of life Catherine felt she couldn't provide. Catherine had agreed, believing she was doing the right thing, the selfless thing, but the agreement came with a condition from her sister. Catherine had to step back completely, had to let Isabel believe this new family was her only family. No confusion, no divided loyalties. Catherine had honored that agreement for years, watching her daughter grow up from a distance, becoming a stranger to her own child. By the time Isabel was a teenager, and Catherine was finally in a position to reveal the truth, to try to rebuild their relationship, Isabel's adoptive parents had both died in a car accident, and Isabel had spiraled into a grief and anger that made her unreachable. Catherine had tried, Patricia emphasized. She'd tried so hard to connect with Isabel after that, to explain, to apologize, to offer any kind of support. But Isabel had been too hurt, too broken by then, and she'd rejected every attempt. She'd fallen into drugs and destructive relationships, had 2 children with different fathers, and had pushed away anyone who tried to help her, including Catherine. When Isabel died of an overdose, Catherine had been devastated. She'd tried to get custody of us, of Marcus and me, had filed paperwork and attended hearings, but she'd been in her late 50s by then with health problems and limited income, and the state had determined she wasn't suitable. We'd been placed in foster care instead, and Catherine had been given no rights, no access, no way to be part of our lives. My throat felt tight listening to this. I wanted to be angry, wanted to blame someone, but I didn't know who. Catherine for giving up her daughter? The system for keeping us from our grandmother? Our mother for not being able to overcome her demons? It all felt like a tragic chain reaction where everyone had been hurt and no one had meant for any of it to happen. Patricia told us that Catherine had spent the last 20 years of her life trying to build something for us, something she could leave behind that might make up for all the ways she'd failed. She'd lived simply in a cabin she'd inherited from her own parents on Lake Quinault, about 3 hours southwest of Seattle. She'd worked as a seamstress and taken on alterations, saving every penny she could. She'd developed advanced emphysema from a lifetime of smoking, a habit Patricia said Catherine had picked up during those early years of stress and never been able to quit. And in her final years, she'd known time was running out. She'd updated her will, hired Patricia to find us after her death, and left us everything. The cabin, the 5 acres it sat on, and a modest savings account she'd built up specifically for us. Patricia handed us another folder, this one containing legal documents, property deeds, and financial statements. The cabin was fully paid off, worth about $300,000 according to a recent appraisal. The savings account had $47,000 in it. For people like Marcus and me, who'd never had more than a few $100s at once, these numbers felt completely surreal, like someone else's life we were reading about. But Patricia wasn't finished. She told us there was one more thing, something Catherine had insisted on including in her will. There was someone still living at the cabin, someone Catherine had cared for in her final years, and Catherine's will stipulated that this person must be allowed to stay as long as they wished, that we couldn't sell the property without making alternative arrangements for them first. I felt my stomach drop. Of course, there was a complication. Nothing in our lives had ever been straightforward, so why would this be different? I asked who this person was, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. Patricia smiled slightly, like she'd expected this reaction, and said the person's name was Dorothy Callahan, that she was 81 years old, and that she'd been Catherine's closest friend for over 30 years. Dorothy had been living at the cabin for the past 5 years after losing her own home, and Catherine had made it clear in her will that Dorothy's welfare was just as important to her as making sure Marcus and I got our inheritance. Marcus spoke up for the first time, his voice uncertain but determined, asking if we could visit the cabin, see it for ourselves, and meet this Dorothy person before making any decisions. Patricia said absolutely that she'd been hoping we'd want to do exactly that, and she'd already contacted Dorothy to let her know we might be coming. She handed us a set of keys and directions, then paused and added something that would stick with me. She said Catherine had written us a letter, that it was sealed and waiting at the cabin with Dorothy, and that Catherine had wanted us to read it in the place she'd loved most, surrounded by the life she'd tried to build for us, even though we'd never known she existed. We left Patricia's office in a daze, walking through downtown Seattle without really seeing anything, both of us trying to process what we'd just learned. We'd had a grandmother who'd spent 2 decades thinking about us, saving for us, building something for us, and we'd never known. We'd grown up believing we were completely alone in the world, and that hadn't been true. The anger came later, after the shock wore off. We sat in my apartment that night, and I felt this rage building in my chest at all the wasted time, all the years of feeling abandoned, all the foster homes and social workers, and the constant message that nobody wanted us. Catherine had wanted us. She'd fought for us after our mother died. The system had just decided she wasn't good enough. Marcus was quieter in his anger, which was somehow worse than if he'd been yelling. He just kept saying he didn't understand why she hadn't kept trying, why she'd let the state take us, why she'd spent 20 years at a distance instead of forcing her way into our lives somehow. I didn't have good answers because I had the same questions. We decided to go see the cabin that weekend. Neither of us knew what to expect, whether we'd feel any connection to this place or this woman, Dorothy, whether any of this would feel real or just like another disappointment waiting to happen. But we had to see it, had to try to understand what Catherine had been trying to give us. The drive to Lake Quinault took us through forests so dense and green they almost didn't look real, towering Douglas firs and moss covered everything. The kind of Pacific Northwest landscape that feels ancient and untouched. We followed Patricia's directions onto increasingly narrow roads until we found a gravel driveway with a hand-painted sign that said Florists in faded letters. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by massive trees, a small structure with cedar siding weathered to a soft gray, a green metal roof, and a covered porch that wrapped around the front. Beyond it, through the trees, we could see glimpses of the lake, deep blue and perfectly still in the late morning light. It was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache, beautiful in a way that made me angry all over again, because this could have been our home, and instead we'd spent our childhoods in places that had never wanted us. We sat in the car for several minutes, neither of us ready to get out, to make this real. Finally, Marcus opened his door, and I followed, and we walked up to the porch on legs that felt unsteady. Before we could knock, the front door opened, and a tiny elderly woman with white hair in a braid and bright blue eyes looked out at us. She didn't say anything at first, just studied our faces with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. Then tears started rolling down her cheeks, and she whispered that we looked so much like Catherine that she could see Isabel in us, too, and that she'd been waiting so long to meet us. Dorothy Callahan invited us inside like we were family she'd been expecting, and the cabin's interior took my breath away. It was small but perfectly organized, filled with natural light from numerous windows, with built-in bookshelves and storage that maximized every inch of space. There were quilts draped over furniture, plants growing in sunny corners, and everywhere I looked, I saw signs of careful attention, of someone who'd loved this place and poured that love into every detail. Dorothy made us tea. She moved slowly but with purpose, clearly dealing with the kind of joint pain that comes with age, and we sat at a small wooden table by a window overlooking the lake. She asked about our lives, really asked, wanting to know about us rather than rushing to explain or defend or share her own story. Marcus and I found ourselves talking more freely than we'd expected, telling her about growing up in foster care, about the apartment in Seattle, about our dreams of maybe going to college someday, if we could figure out how to afford it. She listened without interrupting, and when we'd finished, she told us about Catherine. Not the facts Patricia had already shared, but the real person beneath those facts. Catherine had been funny, Dorothy said, with a sharp wit and a tendency to laugh at inappropriate moments. She'd been stubborn, sometimes maddeningly so, but also generous in ways both large and small. She'd loved this cabin with an intensity that bordered on spiritual, had spent countless hours on that porch watching the light change on the lake, finding peace in the natural rhythms of this place. Catherine had talked about us constantly, Dorothy said, had wondered what we looked like, what kind of people we were becoming, whether we were happy or struggling. She'd cut out every article she could find about foster care reform, had written letters to lawmakers about improving the system, and had channeled her helplessness about her own grandchildren into trying to make things better for other kids in similar situations. Dorothy stood up slowly and retrieved a box from a shelf, setting it on the table between us. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, but none of them were of us. Instead, they were of this cabin through different seasons, of the lake at sunrise and sunset, of the garden Catherine had cultivated, of projects she'd completed on the property. Each photo had a date on the back and a note in handwriting I didn't recognize. For Elena and Marcus, spring 2015, or for the kids, Christmas 2018. She'd been documenting this place for us, creating a visual history of the home she hoped we'd someday inherit, the life she was building with us in mind, even though we weren't there to see it. I had to excuse myself to the bathroom because I was crying too hard to hide it, and I didn't want to break down completely in front of this stranger who'd known my grandmother better than I ever would. The bathroom was small and clean, with a window looking out into the forest, and I stared at my reflection in the mirror and tried to recognize myself as someone who had roots, someone who came from somewhere specific, someone who'd been loved by a grandmother I'd never met. When I came back out, Dorothy had set a sealed envelope on the table, the letter Patricia had mentioned. My name and Marcus's were written on the front in that same handwriting from the photo captions, and I could tell from the weight of it that Catherine had had a lot to say. Marcus looked at me, silently asking if I was ready, and I nodded even though I wasn't sure. He carefully opened the envelope and pulled out several pages of handwritten text on cream-colored stationery, and because I couldn't trust my voice, I gestured for him to read it aloud. Catherine's letter started with an apology that was so raw and honest it hurt to hear. She took full responsibility for every choice she'd made, for giving up Isabel, for respecting boundaries that should have been challenged, for not fighting harder when we'd been placed in foster care. She didn't make excuses or try to justify anything. She just acknowledged that she'd failed us in fundamental ways and that no inheritance could make up for that. But she also explained her thinking, the context we hadn't had before. She wrote about being 19 and terrified, about truly believing Isabel would have a better life with a stable family, about the shame and pressure she'd felt as a single mother in a different era. She wrote about the agony of watching Isabel grow up from a distance, of respecting an agreement she came to regret more every day. She wrote about finding out Isabel had died, about trying desperately to get custody of us and being rejected, about the social worker who told her bluntly that she'd already proven herself an unfit mother by giving away one child and wouldn't be allowed to damage two more. Those words had broken something in her, she wrote, had made her believe maybe she was the problem, maybe we were better off without her in our lives. But she couldn't stop thinking about us, couldn't stop wondering and worrying and hoping. So she'd done the only thing she could think of, tried to build us a foundation, a place where we could start over whenever we were ready, where we could find some peace and stability she'd never been able to give us directly. The cabin had been her parents' place, somewhere she'd spent summers as a child, and she'd inherited it when they died. She'd moved there permanently 15 years ago when her health started declining, and Seattle became too expensive and too overwhelming. She'd fixed it up slowly, learning carpentry and plumbing from YouTube videos and library books, making it into something worthy of being left to grandchildren she might never meet. She wrote about Dorothy, about how their friendship had saved her from complete isolation, about how Dorothy had lost her own home to medical debt after her husband's cancer treatment, and how inviting her to live at the cabin had filled some of the loneliness that had defined Catherine's life. She asked us, if we decided to keep the property, to let Dorothy stay, not as an obligation but as a continuation of the kindness that had made both their lives bearable. The letter ended with hope, guarded but genuine. She hoped we'd love the cabin the way she had. She hoped we'd find some peace there, some sense of home she'd never been able to provide any other way. She hoped we'd understand that she'd thought about us every single day, that we'd been loved even in our absence, and that this imperfect inheritance was the best way she knew to say she was sorry and that our lives mattered to her more than her own. Marcus's voice broke on the last paragraph, and we sat there in that bright kitchen with Dorothy, three people connected by loss and absence and love that had existed despite everything working against it. Dorothy reached across the table and took both our hands, her skin paper-thin and warm, and she said something that shifted everything for me. She said Catherine had been terrified we'd hate her, hate this place, reject the whole thing out of anger for what we'd been denied. But she'd done it anyway, had built this and saved this and left this for us because she believed we deserved something beautiful, something stable, something that was ours without conditions or time limits or the threat of it being taken away. And that's what this was, Dorothy said, gesturing around the cabin. Not an apology that could erase the past, but a foundation for a different future if we wanted it. A place where we could choose what came next instead of having it chosen for us. I looked at Marcus, and I could see he was thinking the same thing I was. We'd been angry. We were still angry about everything that had been kept from us, about the grandmother we'd never gotten to know, about the years of foster care that maybe could have been avoided. But we were also tired of being angry, tired of letting the past define every choice we made. This cabin, this place, was offering us something we'd never had, the ability to write our own story in a space that was unconditionally ours. We could stay angry and reject it, prove that we'd been damaged too badly by our experiences to accept kindness even when it came too late. Or we could choose differently. We spent the rest of that weekend at the cabin with Dorothy, and she showed us everything Catherine had done to make it livable and lovely. The garden beds were ready for spring planting, the small writing studio Catherine had built in a converted shed, the root cellar where she'd stored canning projects and preserved foods, and the trail down to the lake where she'd walked every morning regardless of the weather. Dorothy told us stories that made Catherine real in a way documents never could. How she'd once driven 3 hours in a snowstorm to deliver a wedding dress she'd altered because the bride had forgotten to pick it up. How she'd taught neighborhood kids to sew for free every summer. How she'd cried watching nature documentaries because she found David Attenborough's voice soothing. How she'd talked to the plants in her garden and sworn they grew better for it. We learned that Catherine had been diagnosed with emphysema 8 years before she died, that it had progressed slowly at first but accelerated in the final years, that she'd spent her last 6 months on oxygen and still insisted on sitting outside every day because she couldn't bear being separated from the natural world she loved. Dorothy had been with her at the end, here in this cabin, and she told us, hesitatingly, not sure if we wanted to know, that Catherine's last words had been about us, hoping we'd find the place someday, hoping we'd understand. On Sunday evening, before we drove back to Seattle, Marcus and I sat on the porch watching the sun set over Lake Quinault, and we made a decision. We'd keep the cabin. We'd move here, both of us, and try to build something real out of this inheritance we'd never expected. And Dorothy would stay, not because Catherine's will required it, but because she was part of this story now, part of the family we were choosing to create. The practical challenges were significant. I'd have to quit my job in Seattle, and Marcus would need to find work near Quinault. We'd be leaving the only area we'd ever known for a tiny community where we'd be strangers. But we'd been strangers everywhere we'd ever lived, and at least this time we'd be strangers in a place that was actually ours. Over the next 6 weeks, we made it happen. I gave notice at all 3 jobs, broke my lease by paying an extra month's rent, and packed up our meager belongings. Marcus started applying for jobs in the area. There was a community college about 45 minutes away where he could study forestry and work part-time in their maintenance department. Dorothy, who'd been terrified we'd sell the property and displace her, threw herself into helping us plan the move, pulling out old maps of the area, connecting us with locals who might have job opportunities, and teaching us what we'd need to know about living in a rural area versus the city we'd always known. The day we moved in permanently, carrying boxes into what was now actually our home, felt surreal. Dorothy had cleaned everything, put fresh sheets on the beds in the 2 small bedrooms, and made a welcome dinner that smelled incredible. She'd also made something else, a quilt with patches of fabric Catherine had collected over the years, pieces from projects she'd completed, scraps she'd saved, all sewn together into something beautiful and useful. She presented it to us that first night with tears in her eyes, saying Catherine had started it years ago, but hadn't finished it before she died, and Dorothy had completed it for us. Each patch represented something from Catherine's life, and Dorothy had written a small guide explaining what we were looking at: fabric from the dress Catherine had worn to her high school graduation, material from curtains she'd made for her first apartment, a piece of the blanket she'd wrapped baby Isabel in, scraps from projects she'd completed for customers she'd known for decades. It was a history we'd never been part of, but it was ours now, tangible proof that we'd come from someone, that we'd been thought about and loved even in our absence. That night, Marcus and I sat up late on the porch, wrapped in that quilt, listening to the sounds of the lake and the forest, and for the first time in our lives, we felt like we'd come home. The months that followed weren't easy. Rural living was harder than we'd anticipated. We had to learn about well systems and septic tanks, about winterizing pipes and stacking firewood, about the million small things that people who grow up in houses instead of apartments take for granted. But Dorothy was patient, teaching us everything she knew, and we were determined to figure it out. I found work at a small craft store in Quinault that also sold some of Catherine's preserved work on consignment, quilts and sewn items she'd made in her final years. The owner, a woman named Beth who'd been Catherine's friend, hired me partly out of kindness, but also because I genuinely loved the work, helping customers with their projects, learning more about the crafts Catherine had mastered. Marcus thrived at the community college, discovering he had a real passion for environmental science and forestry management. He'd come home full of facts about watershed protection and old-growth ecosystems, and we'd take walks through our property while he identified plants and explained the forest's ecology with enthusiasm I'd never seen in him before. Dorothy became the grandmother we'd never had, though none of us used that word explicitly. She taught us to cook properly, sharing recipes she and Catherine had perfected over decades. She told us stories about her own life, about losing her husband, about the financial devastation that followed his illness, about the shame she'd felt becoming homeless in her 70s, and about Catherine's matter-of-fact kindness in offering her a place to stay without pity or judgment. We celebrated Dorothy's 82nd birthday that first year with a cake I attempted to bake. It was lopsided but edible, and gifts we'd pooled our limited money to buy. She cried, saying she'd thought she'd spend her final birthdays alone, and now she had us, this unexpected family that had formed out of grief and complicated inheritances. The cabin itself began to feel truly lived in, truly ours. We made small improvements. Marcus built a bookshelf using wood from a fallen tree on the property and YouTube tutorials. I planted the garden beds with vegetables and flowers, and Dorothy organized years of accumulated possessions into a system that actually made sense. We found Catherine everywhere, in the careful construction of storage spaces, in the way certain windows were positioned to catch specific light, in the garden layout that maximized sun exposure while protecting vulnerable plants. I found a journal Catherine had kept, hidden in a box in the storage shed. It wasn't a diary exactly, more like a record of thoughts and observations about the property, plans for improvements, notes about weather patterns, and plant growth. But interspersed throughout were entries about us. Elena would be 16 today. I wonder if she's still in Seattle, if she's happy, if she thinks about her mother. I hope someone is telling her she's loved. Marcus turns 12 tomorrow. Isabel was 12 when I lost touch with her completely. I can't let myself think about patterns repeating, about damage passing through generations like genetic inheritance. But I think about it anyway. Spent all day cutting firewood and stacking it for next winter. My lungs are struggling more lately. Maybe I won't see next winter, though the doctor says I've got a few years if I'm careful. I'm not worried about dying. I'm worried about dying before the kids find this place, before they know someone was thinking about them, building something for them, hoping they'd make it here eventually. Reading those entries, I felt the anger I'd been carrying begin to shift into something more complicated. Grief for all the lost time, yes, but also recognition of the different ways people can love from impossible distances. Catherine had failed us in the ways that mattered most when we were young, but she tried to make amends in the only way left to her. Our second winter at the cabin was hard. January brought snow that isolated us for days at a time, and Dorothy caught pneumonia that scared us badly. We took her to the hospital in Aberdeen, over an hour away on icy roads, and sat with her through 3 days of treatment before she was stable enough to come home. She was fragile after that, moving more slowly, tiring more easily, and it forced us to confront the reality that she wouldn't be with us forever. She started telling us more stories during those long winter evenings, wanting us to know everything about Catherine before the memories faded. She told us about Catherine's guilt, how it had never faded but had transformed into a determination to live differently, to treat others with the grace she hadn't been able to extend to herself and her own family. She told us about the year Catherine had spent volunteering at a foster care organization, trying to understand what we might have experienced, trying to imagine our lives. She'd lasted only 6 months before the emotional weight became too much. Every child she met reminded her of us. Every story of placement failure or family rejection broke her heart all over again. Dorothy also told us about the will, how she'd argued with Catherine about including the stipulation that she be allowed to stay. Dorothy had said it wasn't fair to burden us with an elderly stranger, but Catherine had been adamant. She'd said we'd understand what it meant to have nowhere to go, that we'd extend the kindness because we'd needed it ourselves and never received it, and that proving her right about that would be proof we'd somehow survived foster care with our compassion intact. It occurred to me that Catherine had been testing us, in a way, or maybe just hoping we'd be better than the world had been to us. And maybe we were, or maybe we were just tired of perpetuating cycles of abandonment and rejection. Either way, Dorothy's staying had been the easiest decision we'd made, and I told her so. Spring came eventually, the way it always does, and with it came renewal. Marcus graduated from community college with high honors and was accepted into a forestry program at the university in Olympia on a full scholarship. He'd commute from the cabin when possible and stay in the dorms when necessary, but he'd made it clear this was home now, the place he'd return to, the address that meant something. I'd been promoted to manager at the craft store, and Beth had started teaching me serious sewing techniques, seeing something in me that reminded her of Catherine. I was working on my first quilt, choosing fabrics carefully, thinking about who might wrap themselves in it someday and what they'd need to feel from its warmth. Dorothy's health had stabilized, and while she'd never be as strong as she'd been, she'd found a comfortable rhythm, knowing her limits and working within them. She spent her days reading, cooking when she had energy, and sitting on the porch watching the lake in all its moods, finding the same peace there that Catherine had found. We'd been living at the cabin for almost 2 years when Marcus found something in the small studio Catherine had built, a cedar box containing letters she'd written but never sent. They were addressed to us, one for each birthday we'd had since she'd learned we existed, starting when I was 5 and Marcus was 1. We read them in order, watching Catherine's handwriting change as arthritis and age affected her fingers, watching her thoughts evolve from desperate apologies to acceptance to hope. The later letters shifted from focusing on the past to imagining our futures, wondering what kind of adults we'd become, hoping the system wouldn't break us, and hoping we'd find each other and stay together. The final letter, written the week before she died, according to the date, was different. She said she was ready to go, that she was tired and hurting and ready for whatever came next. But she was also content because she'd finished this, the cabin ready, the will finalized, the letter Patricia would give us written and waiting. She'd done everything she could, and while it would never be enough to erase her failures, maybe it would be enough to give us a start. She ended by saying she hoped we'd forgive her someday, not for her sake. She'd never know whether we did or not, but for ours, because holding on to anger takes energy we might need for building something better. And if we couldn't forgive her, she understood that, too. She just hoped we'd take what she was offering and make it into something that brought us joy. Marcus and I sat with those letters for a long time, passing them back and forth, crying through most of them, and finally understanding that forgiveness isn't about deciding someone deserves it or approving of their choices. It's about choosing to carry something lighter going forward, about acknowledging harm without letting it define everything that comes after. We decided to start a tradition. Every year on the anniversary of moving into the cabin, we'd add something to the property that represented growth or change or hope. The first year, we planted a tree. The second year, we built a small greenhouse. In the third year, we restored the dock Catherine had let fall into disrepair. Each addition was our way of saying this place was ours now, that we were building on what she'd started, making it into something that reflected not just her vision, but ours too. Dorothy helped with every project, contributing ideas and encouragement even when her body couldn't contribute labor. She said watching us take ownership of the property and make it truly ours was the best gift Catherine could have imagined, that she'd be so proud to see what we'd become. One evening, sitting on the porch as the sun set over the lake, our favorite time, the time when everything seemed possible, Dorothy told us she had something to confess. She'd been afraid, she said, that first weekend when we came to see the cabin. Afraid we'd be angry and bitter and resentful, that we'd kick her out or sell everything out of spite, that we'd reject the inheritance and everything it represented. Catherine had been afraid of that, too, she said, had worried constantly that we'd hate her too much to accept anything from her. But they'd both also held on to hope that kids who'd survived the foster system would understand the complicated nature of family, the ways people fail each other and try to make amends, the necessity of building connections wherever you can find them. Marcus and I just listened, and when she finished, I told her something we'd never said out loud before. She was family now, not because Catherine's will said she had to be allowed to stay, but because we'd chosen each other in the aftermath of loss. That choice, that active decision to build something together, meant more than any blood connection that had failed us. That night, wrapped in Catherine's finished quilt, watching stars emerge over the lake, I felt something I'd never expected to feel: peace. Not because everything had been resolved or made right, but because we'd found a way to live with complexity, to accept that people and situations could be both damaging and loving, failing and hopeful, broken and healing all at once. The cabin Catherine left us wasn't just property or financial security, though it was those things too. It was permission to imagine different futures, to believe we deserved stability and beauty and homes that wouldn't be taken away. It was proof that we'd mattered to someone even when we didn't know they existed. And maybe most importantly, it was a lesson about the different ways people can love, imperfectly, from a distance, too late to fix the damage already done, but still real, still worth something. Catherine had loved us the only way she knew how. In the end, by building us a foundation and hoping we'd be strong enough to build something beautiful on top of it. We were, we are, and every day at this cabin. In this life we've built from complicated inheritances and chosen family, and our own determination to be better than our circumstances. We prove that second chances are possible. That home isn't just something you're born into, but something you can create with intention and hope and forgiveness for the broken people who tried their best and failed and tried again anyway. Thank you for listening to this story about Elena, Marcus, Dorothy, and the cabin that changed everything. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about family or forgiveness or the complicated nature of inheritance, please subscribe to this channel. We share real stories about real people navigating difficult circumstances, finding hope in unexpected places, and learning that home is something you can build even when you start with nothing but loss. And please, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever inherited something that came with complicated emotions? Have you had to decide whether to forgive someone who hurt you but also try to make amends? How do you define family when blood relationships have failed you? Your stories and perspectives create community here, and I genuinely love reading every comment. Remember, the most valuable inheritances aren't always houses or money. Sometimes they're the lessons we learn about resilience, the connections we choose to build, and the courage to accept imperfect love from imperfect people who did their best, even when their best wasn't enough. Thanks for being here.